When you look at that level of investment, not the slightest doubt. I mean, I don't know if you're all obsessed with betting here in Norway as we are in Britain, but you could pop along to a bookmaker's now and put a bet on the next person to walk on the moon is going to be Chinese, and most likely the first person to walk on Mars. It's inconceivable, given America's problems, that they could do what Kennedy did and decide for a decade to divert 6% of GDP behind a great project like that. In China, they could. They have those resources. Their consumption is less, their investment is more. They have learned the lesson of Keynes, though they put it in a more Marxist way. And if anything, things are about to get worse. As we speak, the very first Americans are going to vote in their midterm elections. And I think every poll shows that Obama's party will lose seats substantially. But in every single seat that the Republicans are targeting and aiming to take from the Democrats in the House of Representatives or the Senate, every single Republican candidate is a climate change denier. And so it's quite clear America won't be leading in that direction. China will, and of course India has increased its level of investment, now up to 35%. So all of this means a global leadership in these issues isn't going to come out of America. It's much more likely to come out of China. And therefore, what should we be doing in all of this here in Europe? Another thing just to throw into this as I come to the end is when I went to China to open offices in Shanghai and Beijing, because I want to attract students, investment, tourism, we appointed a local woman to run our office in Shanghai. And she told me about her schooling. She went to school at 7 o'clock every morning. She left at 6 o'clock every night for 9 years. She worked harder as a school student than she ever did in any job afterwards. Now, not every Chinese child is getting that, but more and more are. If you look at household spending in China, the biggest single item of household spending, more than on entertainment or food or clothing, it is supplementary education for their children. So in China, you're getting this huge drive, high levels of investment, massive investment in education. And I'm not frightened by that. I'm glad it's happening. But what it does mean, it's the end of 500 years of history in which Europe and then America dominated the world, organized the terms of trade for our convenience, able to rig the terms of trade so we didn't have to work as hard or study as much as we should because we could exploit others. That world's closing. We no longer have the strength economically or militarily to do it. The world we're moving into is going to be a much more equally balanced one. People will be judged on their merits more. Nations will be judged on the risks they take, the levels of investment and the research they do. And that means everyone in Europe be under much more intense competition. And how will Europe respond? All the signs are bad. This is not the Europe of the post-war period that I grew up in, where there was confidence about the future. People signed up to the great European project so there could never be another great European war. People thinking and speculating about a United States of Europe. That vision has died. And in its place, each European nation seems to be turning inward, electing odd parties that are xenophobic, Islamophobic, talking more about protection, just as the Tea Party Republicans are in America. So as the rest of the world becomes more global, there's a real danger Europe will be looking inward, trying to defend what it's achieved, rather than being part of driving that agenda of the future. And you actually see it in the extreme form that President France seems to think it's worth spending a lot of his time cleansing France of the Roma, whilst his economy continues to lose ground relative to the emerging Asian and Latin American economies. You see a referendum in Switzerland where the majority of the population vote to make certain there will never be more than 4 minarets. The entire Swiss way of life could collapse if a 5th minaret appears on the horizon. This isn't a continent confident that it can set part of the agenda for the future of humanity in the 21st century. And I think we need to be very honest with our own people, and politicians aren't. They're pandering to these fears rather than saying the things that we need to do. And it's partly because life feels worse. I don't know, I don't think Norway's in this category because the relative value of your oil, the fact you have no debt. I'm really talking about the rest of Europe rather than Norway here. But life feels worse in a whole series of ways. People feel more vulnerable about crime. They feel they have to work longer and so on. It's as though everything's got slightly worse in the last 30 years. In a sense it has, because there's been a huge shift of wealth, particularly in Britain and America. When Mrs. Thatcher came to power in Britain, the top 10% earned 4 times the bottom 10%. Today that's 8 times. As we face huge cuts in public spending, in the last 12 months in Britain, the chief executives of the 100 largest companies listed on the stock exchange have increased their pay by 55% in 1 year. And much the same has been happening in America. Now, the Republicans have captured that and directed it against Obama, rather than the great captains of industry lining their own pockets and the bankers who've restored all their bonuses. It's directed against immigrants and refugees who are seen to be the problem, rather than the inequalities of wealth in our society. We need to remember that. This great surge of growth in Europe that gave us a quality of life better than anybody had ever had before in history was built on a broad social democratic consensus of redistribution of wealth, of a greater involvement in the community, and actually the decisions that were made in the creation of a good welfare state. I think that, I mean, if you haven't seen it yet, there's an excellent book called The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Rickett, which is available in Penguin, which just shows all these things that people worry about, teenage pregnancy and drug taking, are all of them in some way linked to the inequalities of wealth in society. The more equal a society, the longer people live, and the less teenage pregnancy, the less drug abuse. The one thing I can't explain is that rich people live longer in a more equal society than in a less equal one. And given they live in gated communities and aren't being murdered by the poor, I find that very difficult to explain. Finally, people ask me what I was proudest of as mayor. And people expect me to talk about the bus system we rebuilt, or getting neighbourhood patrols, or the congestion charge. The thing that I was proudest of came on the morning of our bombings, on July the 7th, 2005. Because the minor offspring of Al-Qaeda that planned that, their objective was to divide Londoners. Initially, they wanted to kill a lot, but then what they really wanted was rioting, people turning on Muslims so that they would be radicalized. What was remarkable was that the police have no record of any one Londoner attacking another in that period. The city was absolutely determined to stand united. And that's really what I'm proudest of about the city I represented for 8 years. And why was it? London and New York are similar in many ways. In both cities, over 1/3 of the people were born in a foreign country. In London, we have seen a total transformation. I was born into a monoculture city. There were small immigrant communities, overwhelmingly white English city. And in my lifetime, it's been transformed into the most cosmopolitan in the world. The mayor of New York, when he was bidding for the Olympic Games, claimed that he had 200 languages spoken in his schools, and I had 300 spoken in mine, so he dropped that line when we were before the IOC. If you look at the 25 richest people in London, 15 were born as foreigners. They came to the city, and they created great wealth themselves. They created GDP, they created jobs. They allowed me to tax them a bit and use it for good things. And London is the only city in Europe that matches American levels of productivity and competitiveness. The next city is 20% behind. The average is half. And we are the most open. No other city has such a proportion of foreigners, such a concentration of different communities and faiths. And it doesn't just work as an environment which we love, it's actually effective economically. And I see that as a template for the future. It won't happen overnight, and many cities will never achieve anything like that. But when I talk to the mayors of Shanghai and Mumbai about how rapidly they create a financial and business services center to rival London and New York, I make the point to them. The reason Tokyo never became an equal was in Tokyo only 2% of the people aren't Japanese. The key to this dynamism is openness to people, to capital, to ideas. If you raise walls, if you're frightened of embracing difference and change, you aren't going to be part of setting the agenda for the 21st century. And our younger generation around the world are, in a sense, doing this in their own way. For those young people with enough money to have an iPhone or an iPad or a BlackBerry to access the internet, they surf the world. They choose what they like to comprise their sort of frame of reference of ideas and culture. And it brings me to back a memory I had as a young boy, starting my primary school at the age of 5 in 1950, and my teacher standing in front of a vast map which showed about a third of the world in red, which was ours, even though India had already got independence. And I remember the teacher telling us, and this was taught to me throughout my school life, both as a primary and a secondary student. My teachers told me I lived in the greatest city on earth, in the greatest empire in human history. And one day, the rest of the world could be lifted up to our culture, even the Americans. And that sort of arrogance is doomed. Those who subscribe to it are doomed. They'll be in a cul-de-sac. It's those who embrace the totality of humanity will set our future in terms of the environmental agenda, in terms of our cities. If you want a great world city, it must be open to people to come to it, not just from your own country, but from around the world. They must bring their skills. And it means, therefore, opening to the great new economies growing of China and India and Brazil and the others that will actually follow. What does it mean for Norway? Because I think, as I said, I think Norway's quite unique in terms of your budget deficit, which doesn't seem to be there, your total of GDP debt, which doesn't seem to be there, the ratio of mineral wealth per to population. You have the chance to drive a program of modernization based on investment in new ideas and products and processes, based on modernizing every aspect of your life to be world leaders in energy efficiency that the rest of the world can learn from and cope and adapt. Uniquely, of all the nations of Europe, you are best placed to give that sort of lead, to actually engage between the politicians and the community what needs to be done, to divert those resources and be part of preparing for a new world. Thank you very much. Did I go on too long?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Ken Livingstone. A small souvenir, a presentation of Norwegian
I'll know a
architecture.
bit more about Norway by the time I get off the plane.
You have no idea, I think, how grateful we are for you taking the time to come here and speak to us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I hope I didn't go on too long.
Absolutely not.
Oh, good,
Spot
good.
on.
Do you have any questions, or will you run over?
We're supposed to have a small break. Are there any questions?
Look, can I say, I'm sorry I went on too long because there's supposed to be time for questions, but I left my watch at home. But if you've got any questions, Mark Watts, where's Mark? Is he here? Yeah, Mark in the front row. He did all the work for which I get all the credit. So if you have any questions over the next couple of days or so, get hold of Mark. He'll tell you what role Norway could play in the C40. It's very large cities, I know. But he did all the work, so you might as well go to him. I'm just the puppet. He was actually pulling the strings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ken Livingstone.